as soon as our tech guy comes back, we can get started. And you're not mic'd up either. I wonder if he went to get more batteries. Okay. You ready? All right, please welcome Jarrod Richey.
Well, thank you. A couple quick comments. The title you can see, the Fuging Psalm tune, America's Not So Formal Counterpoint. So we go from Bach to a much more, what you could say, country psalmody. Hopefully this will be interesting to you. A few prefatory comments. This is a outworking of a paper I had with Scott Annual at Southwestern Seminary in Fort Worth this past spring. So he was very helpful to me in encouraging me to press on and to hone my arguments and so forth. So hopefully this will be helpful to you. It is worth noting that this paper was written for an audience of academics and musicians in the program, and so some things I may stop and tweak because that may not be your wheelhouse. That being said, I'd like us to sing to start off, if we can. So, you know this tune. Let's sing it together. So sing whatever you want to do here. Let's stand and we'll sing this together. I'll try to flip through these slides as we go. Ready? Oh, sing a new song to the Lord, for wonders he has done, for wonders he has done. His right hand and his holy arm, the victory has won, the victory has won. All right, you may be seated. What you just sang is a Fuging tune. No doubt you've heard that before. So I wanted to speak about that, but I thought what better way than just to jump right into a verse of one. Here's the outline of basically this talk, but I'll jump right in here. Rather than referring to the American iteration of the European contrapuntal style known as the fugue, the American fuging tune constitutes a very different style and practice than the fugue standardized by men like Palestrina and Bach, who we heard in the last session. Nevertheless, some musicians have expressed disapproval for these colonial American fuging tunes for precisely that reason, preferring instead what one historian referred to as a more ornate style that was even beginning to make its influence felt in the church. While fuging tunes may seem rough and angular, as you heard, that one sounds fun to sing, but it is a little bit more rough than a Bach fugue. Compared to the compositional practices that we know of from Europe, these fuging tunes still possess formative characteristics needed as much today as in the times they were written. While some musicologists may write them off as, quote, uncommon and out of the way, the American fuging tune has strengthened music literacy for churches both in the 18th century and it continues to do so today. This talk will briefly highlight some of the ways certain musicians and hymnologists, I guess you could say, such as Andrew Law, Lowell Mason, and Thomas Hastings, overlooked the value of the fuging tunes and how they provided many things to the Christian churches both in New England and subsequently in Appalachia and other parts of the U.S. in the earliest days, and how this song form continues to provide important lessons for us today. Music historians, I want to argue, overly criticize the 18th century fuging tune for its perceived primitive construction and rustic performance practice. However, the fuging tune has the, I would like to say, the unique ability to combat rationalistic tendencies. I hope to develop that a little bit later or to discuss it at the end. It also is able to reinforce the corporate aspects of worship, something that most people don't care about. And also, ultimately, as a wonderful byproduct, it promotes music literacy. says the music teacher to the room. Yeah. First, I will define the fuguing tune and highlight some of its fundamental characteristics, and that often cause unnecessary confusion and criticism around the song form. Second, I will highlight some of these principal criticisms brought by the aforementioned Andrew Law, Thomas Hastings, and Lowell Mason surrounding the fuguing tunes of primarily the chief fuguing tune composer, William Billings, who you know. Third, I'll answer some of these criticisms and argue that the fuguing tune had and continues to have a helpful place in shaping our worship and worldview. So, you know a fugue. You know this fugue. What a glorious fugue it is. Not uncommon to us. This is not the fugue we're studying, right? This is not Bach, right? And so that's helpful to keep that in your mind. Don't be confused. The fugue we're going to talk about is vocal, what we sang. So they do share the same title, but we will hopefully draw some clear distinctions there. Strictly speaking, the fugue is not an American invention. Like America itself, the fugue has its roots in England, and historical research in this area primarily draws from three men that I have found, scholars Nicholas Temperley, Irving Lowens, and Richard Crawford, as they seek to trace the origins and essential characteristics of the fuguing tune song form. Their detailed work highlights how the fuguing tune arose in England and expanded in New England during the 18th century. As we look at the English development with the growth of singing by note as opposed to singing by rote, if you're not familiar, there was a time in the late 17th century where churches began to, instead of lining out the song or deaconing it out, you would have this push to read music, to be able to read and with understanding, and this was called singing by note as opposed to singing by rote, or it was also known as regular singing. And with this note singing instead of rote singing became more elaborate psalm settings. The fuguing tune was believed the last stage of this evolution of metric psalmody in Europe, or in England, I should say. But this country psalmody, as Nicholas Temperley calls it, developed in these Anglican rural parishes across the English countryside. And one definition you could say for a fuguing tune, if you're wondering what is the elusive definition of a fuguing tune, if it's not the piece you played, would be that it has at least one polyphonic phrase where voices enter successively, giving rise to overlap of text. Temperley notes that before this time, singing had been congregational, monophonic, or heterophonic, and in most churches unaccompanied. Many of these rural churches did not have instruments or professional musicians available to them, and without professional musicians leading in these churches, music understanding and performance deteriorated, and traveling singing masters filled this void of musical leadership. If you look back, if we can get there, I didn't mean to go that way. Oh, I don't know if this is doing. Let's get back there. Notice what we saw here. What I said there. If you notice, the fuguing tune starts with a homophonic texture, a beginning. We'll talk about this a little bit more. And what makes this identifiable is then it breaks. You can see the basses come in, and then we have the sopranos in this one, and the altos and the tenors all coming in, repeating. That's the fuguing tune. Typically, then you repeat that fuguing portion again. We don't often do that in our churches, but that is what has typically been done. These singing masters used to line out, but you can't line out a fuguing tune in the same way unless you have four of yourself, multiple personalities, or whatever someone else is lining out. So it kind of was prohibitive in that way. But they would line out the tune before this time for the choir and for the congregation, providing the only way many choirs and congregations could even sing together. Pastors saw a devotional opportunity here and a need that they could fill, and so they started these religious societies, and one of those religious societies are what we would call the singing schools. And singing schools would pop up where you'd have these itinerant singing masters. They would go around teaching the psalms of their own composition or maybe just their own compilation. And as a result, the fuguing tunes grew in large number in England in this time. And singing masters and tune books and singing schools would only just exponentially increase when it came over across the pond to America. The American Fuging tune, it's believed, it likely made its first appearance in the 1780s, and like its English predecessor, it often featured an open homophonic or block chord-like section to begin, which we saw here, and Irving Loewens says that a fresh start is then made in which each individual voice makes its entrance in succession, the order varying according to the inclination of the composer. Let's see here. The second second section, which he calls the fugue, and he spells that differently. In the classical fugue that you see, this is the conventional spelling, but a lot of these guys, Irving Loewens being the first ones of these, I believe in the 1950s, which really started to use this to further draw the distinction between these two. This being vocal and hymn or psalm, metrical psalm, and this being, instrumental and European as we know it. But Irving Loewens mentions that. He says the fugue then repeats, as I mentioned, and you have a tight A-B-B form. So the homophonic beginning, the fugue, and the fugue repeated, and there's your form. I have in here for you, let's see, a selection. This is a selection of William Billings. His Kittery provides another version of that, not known to you. Probably you don't know this tune. I'll play a little bit of this for you. At least. Oh, you know what? This should be over here. That's why you can't hear it. So, yeah, this should be in here. There we go. Because mine out is going there. Let's do once more with feeling, shall we? Yeah. Yes, and then the next slide picks up the fugue.
Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, thy will is of the way.
I don't have the rest of the music. And then you would repeat that, but for the sake of time, we'll go on. This composition by Billings, tune is called Kittery, provides a prototypical example of the fuging tune for us, just like the opening when the Psalm 95 or 98a we sang. It begins with the homophonic phrase and then gives way to a polyphonic overlapping section where the bass voices lead, followed by tenors, sopranos, and then altos. Similarly, Billings and other composers compose fuging anthems where the parts are more independent and less strophic in layout, you could say. One scholar, George Pullen Jackson, illustrates the unique qualities present in a fugue, or a fuging psalm tune, when he says, and this is one of my favorite quotes, I wish I could have shortened it down, so you just have to bear with me. It says, in the fuging tune, all the parts start together and proceed in rhythmic and harmonic unity, usually for the space of 4 measures or one musical sentence. The end of this sentence marks a cessation, a complete melodic close. During the next 4 measures, the 4 parts set in, one at a time, and 1 measure apart. First, the basses take the lead for a measure long, and as they retire on the second measure to their own proper bass part, the tenors take the lead with a sequence that is imitative of, if not identical with, that sung by the basses. The tenors then, in turn, give way to the altos, and they to the trebles, all 4 parts doing the same passage, though at different pitches, in imitation of the part in the preceding measure. Following this fuging passage comes a 4-measure phrase with all the parts rhythmically neck and neck, and this closes the piece, though the last 8 measures are often repeated. You see why it was hard to hack that up. It's a nice description Jackson gives of what's happening in a fuging tune. And Kittery does just that, with the exception of the entrance of the sopranos and the altos, but other than that, it holds to his description. So early colonial American churches used many tunes in tune books from England, of course, but several factors contributed to the rapid expansion of uniquely American fuging tunes, these psalm tunes, metrical psalm tunes. First, the American fuging tunes' rise coincided with the colonist struggles with the British monarchy, which we're all familiar with, surrounding the fight for independence. Each passing months, it would seem, tensions increased and more colonists wanting fewer and fewer influences with the crown and associations. Singing and worship practice was likely no exception. Second, the singing school movement's very business model, if you know anything about this, that these itinerant singing masters would profit most when teaching psalm tunes from their own tune books. Third, singing by note or regular singing was more suited to polyphonic song textures than many of the previous homophonic textures. If you don't know what that means, a hymn, Amazing Grace, is a homophonic texture, right? These fuguing tunes are polyphonic. There's, like Ken Myers said, there's imitation happening, albeit it's not species counterpoint imitation on the level of Bach or Haydn or Palestrina or others, but it's imitative that far and no more, it seems. So the fuguing tune was unable to be lined out, as I mentioned earlier, or taught by rote. It's too difficult to do it, and so it really lent itself for a music literacy in that way. All these factors contributed to the adoption and the expansion of the tune in America. Here's where some ambiguity and unnecessary confusion I find comes in. One of the chief things that bothers people I discovered in my research is that the fuguing tune's very name, it's the very thing that causes consternation, because its origins are not, as I said, in the former counterpoint style and practice of Palestrina or Sebastian Bach. Instead, its name merely sought to communicate that a fuguing tune was imitative with voices interacting independently for some length during the psalm composition. Nevertheless, one scholar as recent as the 1940s, this is my favorite, still erroneously claimed that, here's his quote, "The fuguing tune as written by the New England composers in William Billings' day was only a pitiful imitation of that part of the fugue known as the exposition." Irving Lowens goes on to clarify that an examination of the etymology of the term fuguing tune displays its pedigree, a shortened version of the term fuguing psalm tune. Lowens takes to task a man named Hamilton Crawford McDougall, the antagonist of the fuguing tune, who wrongly asserts that it was a poor exposition. The exposition in a fugue, and a proper fugue, and a Bach fugue, as you all well know, there's no exposition in a fuguing tune. And he says, it's a poor deal. Hamilton McDougall, Scott Aniel, I was like, that if ever there was an antagonist name, Hamilton Crawford McDougall, how dare you, speak ill of the fugue. But, maybe Eustace would have been a second name for this guy. But anyway, this omission, we call it the fuguing tune, but we leave off fuguing psalm tune. This omission or shortening further demonstrates that the fuguing psalm tune should not be confused with the formal counterpoint technique that shares its name, despite the common term. Moreover, the fuguing tune is a metrical composition that prioritizes text over tune. If you walk away with thinking about the fuguing tune, it's text, not tune. It is written by people who are concerned about singing text, not about having the various proper parts of species counterpoint. Counterpoint, as I said, it will be harmonic and melodic in its interaction, even rhythmic, but the text being carried is the sole desire and focus of these hymn writers, these metrical psalm writers, and the tunes that they wrote for these. So, William Billings, he's the father of American choral music, depending on who you ask. He's definitely a lion's share of the fuguing tune composition in the States. If you want to understand it, you've got to look at him and the majority of his compositions. Billings became the most prominent target of criticisms of the fuguing tune because, for a number of reasons. One being his lack of formal training. Two, because he had such a substantial amount of fuguing tunes that he wrote. And three, the affinity he had for what I call an American revolutionary aesthetic. All these things just tied these guys in knots that would come later. Talking about the first of that, Billings had very little training. He was obviously not a Paris Conservatory graduate. He was no European trainee. But his story is emblematic, I want to argue, of the larger story of America. The criticisms that were brought by later composers undervalue, if not ignore, the historical context in which he wrote. Billings was 14 years old when his father passed away. His formal education would have likely ceased, and subsequently he took on tannery as a trade. So after this point, any musical training he might have received would have likely come from reading the front of tune books and singing schools in the Boston area where he grew up. This seemingly insignificant detail does seem to suggest that Billings, like the country he was so proud to call home, had only modest resources in shaping his development. The New England colonies had begun their settlements in an early time of peace, only to see that cease with what became known as the War for American Independence. Hence, William Billings' lack of formal training does seem to suggest and explain the perceived qualities in his composition, some of which we'll discuss. It also reflects his revolutionary spirit in his early psalmody. Look no further than his Chester, if you know, "Let tyrants shake their iron rod," right? We know that tune, which is some would argue is the informal national anthem before Francis Scott Key. That was William Billings. Billings' compositional output did seem to mirror the spirit of 76, as it were, in a couple of different ways. First, the singing masters in Billings' time indeed preferred the use of their own tunes and tune books for the sales potential it afforded them. It was doubly true with Billings. While Billings did not strictly invent the Fuging tune, his vast compositional output has led scholars like Edwin Pierce even to assert that Billings' compositions give him claim to the ownership of the style. He states, "Of course, the use of polyphony, of various sorts of canon and free imitation, and the full-fledged vocal fugue itself were and had been for centuries commonplaces in anthems, masses, oratorios, choruses, and motets. But apparently no one before Billings seems to have thought of weaving them into one concise, rhythmically and metrically bounded form of a hymn tune for ordinary congregational singing." Pierce and others gathered styles and compositional patterns precisely because Billings had enough compositional output than anybody that came before him and likely after him, as far as I've been able to see. Scholar Richard Crawford estimates that there were roughly a dozen American-composed psalm tunes before 1770. The lion's share of what they were using they brought over from England. He states that Billings increased that figure tenfold. Second, Billings' music was widespread and closely connected to the revolutionary cause, as I mentioned. One thing of interest is Paul Revere engraved the frontispiece of his first edition of his tune book, The New England Psalm Singer. And it is even said that Billings was close friends with Samuel Adams. So he was right in the middle of this chaotic time in the American War for Independence. He was rooted in that spirit, and his work seemed to reflect that. I also would argue our charity towards him and towards his abilities should also reflect that time. He didn't write in a vacuum. And all in all, as scholar Carl Lindstrom expresses, the Fuging tune was for Billings a, quote, fascinating and amusing hybrid growth in a strange field. It may be considered his crowning achievement as a creative musician, and the full measure of that honor is to be fully appreciated only in the light of the unpropitious and anomalous circumstances in which he flourished, end quote. Okay, here comes the criticisms. We're going to boom these. The only thing it said, you've heard me say it because I say the same 4 jokes and then I just mix up the order again and again. So you can't even number them. You just have to know, oh, I've heard that one about 7 times. But I learned from my major professor that when I was in grad school, the famous aphorism, the only thing that 2 musicians can agree upon is the incompetence of a third. So it's quite easy to find people that disagree with William Billings. But the 3 areas that we'll focus on and the folks that represent those criticisms, lyrical chaos, inadequate harmonies, and the perceived lack of performance ability comprise the most frequent objections to the American Fuging psalm tune. So, lyrical chaos. John Hubbard gives the most widely cited criticism of the Fuging tune when he protests, and this is quite a massive words here, but as far as quite a pointed, I should say, criticism. To catch any idea from such a chaos of words uttered at the same time and the same instant of time, a hearer must first be furnished with the ears as numerous, listen to me, as numerous as the eyes of Argus. Such fugues must be a perversion. They cannot affect the heart, nor inform the understanding. Oh, but they can. They actually can. Sorry, can't let that one go. This criticism seems to miss a key aspect in evaluating this so-called perversion, as Hubbard calls it. Hubbard criticizes the fact that he cannot understand the lyrics in a fuguing tune because they occur at the same time as one another. This criticism, I believe, wrongly assumes that the value and the meaning is mostly, if not entirely, tied up to the intelligibility of the hearer. And that's what's determining the value of the thing being sung. But we would say, I would hope, whether intelligible to the hearer or not, the singer still possesses the ability to understand the song's words. There is little, if any, accounting for that value in Hubbard's critique of this lyrical chaos. For the value of lyrics provide in shaping both the singer that sings them, not just the listener. We don't like the idea of just spectators in our worship. So anyway, when it comes to Christian worship, some song texts, as we know, are sung to God and not to one another. The triune audience, who perfectly understands the lyric, does not need the eyes or ears of Argus, as Hubbard says, for he sees and hears all. Just because someone that's listening complains that they are unable to hear does not automatically mean there is no understanding present in the thing being sung. We wouldn't have trouble with that statement, I'm sure. And furthermore, if the whole congregation is actively singing, then everyone present understands. Seems like that's a nice, easy resolution, dust off the hands and go home. But there are no spectators in worship. Sadly, the trouble is that there are too many spectators. There are two numbers in our churches today and not enough singing participants. And that may be why some of the criticism comes. Second criticism, inadequate harmonies. What do I mean by that? At the same time, reformers criticize fuguing tunes for using different harmonies and cadences. Although he used the fuguing tunes early on in his singing career, one scholar, Andrew Law, later would go on to chide the overuse of perfect chords that were harmonized in fourths and fifths. Let me show you what I mean. Some of you may not know what that means. In a perfect fourth or perfect fifth, this is oftentimes you have too much of this, you have the strong urge to eat mugu gaipen. But in Billings music, there's a lot of fourths and fifths. They're hollow. They don't have the deal there. Subsequent composers didn't want to do that. Give us, all these sixes and thirds. This is the critique of the harmonies. They're hollow, they're fourths and fifths. They don't have the sweet thirds that the European composers had. They also didn't have the sweet conservatory training that the European composers had either, but I digress. Instead of moving from thirds in harmonic passing progression, the fuguing tunes in early America had a more hollow and open harmonic quality. Edwin Hall Pierce echoes Andrew Law's assessment when he says that Billings used too many parallel fifths. And he said, chords with no third, clumsy crossing of voices, etc. This compositional practice seemed to offend many of the later reformers who would come after, and they sought to clean up the fuguing tune, that's one charitable way of saying it, or just get rid of it altogether. That was their idea. A third critique of the fuguing tune you probably share to a point is the conflating with singing of inability with the compositional validity. All that to say, put it in simpler terms, singing poorly does not make the song composition good or bad necessarily. It can be a correlation, but I think it was too quickly associated. In the 18th century fuguing tune, we find that it's harshly judged because of the poor quality and vocal technique many used in singing them. You've seen this that in Appalachia and Kentucky, these shape note fuguing tunes and all of this, and fa, sol, la, all of this, and it's not exactly the height of vocal technique. But they did the best they could, right? That was what they knew, and we need to give thanks for it. Many of these frontier congregations living in the middle of wartime, right? I'm sorry, you just don't have time to treat things in the same way as 200 years of peace. So I think that's worth noting, and in my estimation, you don't have a lot of that from these scholars and musicians that came afterwards. Many of these congregations did not have the training in literacy, as I said, music literacy, much less vocal technique, that would come about in the next half century. And as a result, the quality of the singing was called barbarous howling, is one article. That's a clickbait if ever there was one on a journal website for us music nerds, barbarous howling. Yes, I would like to read that. Yes, I share the critique at times, but that does not mean that just because some of these people were howling barbarously, that does not mean the Fuging tune in itself possesses some inherent deficiency that even causes that poor singing ability. But still, some blamed the inferior quality of the singing and associated that with the tune itself. A bit more notes. Andrew Law, as I mentioned earlier, was one of the first guys to advocate the Fuging tune and then about face and say, no more. 1793, Michael Broyles, a scholar, who's got a very good book I commend to you, Music of the Highest Class, Elitism and Populism in Antebellum Boston. It's an interesting book. He talks about in 1793, Andrew Law, who was a Presbyterian minister, said, no more, it's European music for me, and dropped it. And even fell off the deep end in a way. He got so annoyed with this harshness of the Yankee singing style, as they called it, that he said, we got to file our voices. He even went so far as to change the notation system. He got rid of the 5-note staff. I mean, this guy was just the movable floor, it seemed to be. But it was interesting because one of the loudest critics at the end of his days of the Fuging tune was one of the early proponents of it in America. And I thought it was worth looking into what he said and how he came to see it. He would call the Fuging tune frivolous and frolicsome in succession. He seemed to highlight an overly subjective and individualistic philosophy, which I sadly can't really go into here. He assigned merit with harmonic structure and not really a combination of text and tune and rhythm, I would argue. So anyway, there's some other things that could be said there, but for the sake of time, you'll just have to do the research yourself, I guess, or I can send you the paper. You can see more of the trajectory. But Andrew Law's fixation on the European aesthetic that I mentioned, the thirds and the more refined, simpler, stately sounds that even hymn tunes can have, did lead to that weird proprietary note shape system. And I would say that it caused me, at least, to carry less weight of his criticisms. And albeit the other folks that criticized weren't as maybe harsh, Thomas Hastings and Lowell Mason, that we will mention. I'll mention a few comments about. Thomas Hastings took up the pen of criticism. He's the hymn writer. You've known some of his tunes. You may not know his name as much as you might know Lowell Mason. But he criticized the Fuging tune for what he called the rapid music of a rude character. He had a dissertation on musical taste, a long treatise that he provides considerable insight regarding the metamorphosis of music practice and philosophy in the 50 years since the American War of Independence. Thomas Hastings, for his part, believed that the quote old masters of the singing of the Fuging tune in America were greatly negligent in their taste for fugue and imitation. He often said, he once said, that this often led them to the most unmeaning repetitions of the text. He advocated instead for a return to the European definition of fugue and imitation, where, quote, a single passage of melody, as sung by two or more individuals, would commence at different times. And he argued that would produce what he called correct harmony. When used in sacred music, he argued that fugues should never be employed merely for their own sake, nor for the display of talent, but always for the illustration and enforcement of the words to which they are applied. We wouldn't disagree with that on its face. Interestingly enough, he regarded the most appropriate use of the fugue to be in what he called the representation or the chase of fugitives, or the clamors of a multitude. If you were looking at certain choruses by Haydn and Handel, that's when he thought a fugue should go, when there's this text painting of chasing imagery. Say again?
The turbo movement.
Yes. Yes. So he promoted that. For instance, Hastings elevates Handel's All We Like Sheep from Messiah that we all know, stating that it could scarcely fail to appear ridiculous in the multiplied reiterations of an elaborate fugue. Compared to a fuging psalm tune with its aforementioned unmeaning repetitions of text, he argued, Hastings makes allowance for the repetition and overlap of text when it comes to the music of Handel. True enough, Handel did have more musical training, and it was more extensive than any of the frontier composers such as Billings. But still, Hastings does not seem to give the same judgment of charity to composers like William Billings that he does Handel, or no doubt like he would give to Bach or to Haydn. This inconsistency leaves more questions than answers, for me at least, when regarding Hastings' criticisms. Furthermore, in his criticism of the Fuging tune, Hastings also seemed to struggle to balance religious and aesthetic purposes. He often would seemingly contradict himself. On the one hand, he would delight in the vocal works of Handel, namely the Hallelujah Chorus, which he wrote a good bit about. But on the other, he could not condone the genre from which it came because he was tainted with the profane associations, as he called it, and it bothered him that it was frequently the Messiah was frequently performed in opera houses. So that was a consternation to him. He later said, "No one thinks of attending a religious meeting when he goes to the oratorio." Well, okay, but yeah, I don't know that we're going to follow you down that track. Anyway, Frederick Ritter, you might have read some of his writings. He said he praised Hastings as being the last representative psalm tune teacher on the one hand, but also picked up on this and said he reckoned him as contradictory. So there's a double-mindedness both to Andrew Law and to Thomas Hastings, even though these men did good work for the church and have written some good tunes. But they wrestled with this dichotomy of religious devotion and sacred music, as we all are called to do in one sense. And scholar Gilbert Chase suggests that Hastings took a dim view of aesthetic purposes on the whole. If you read his dissertation on musical taste, he goes on to say that he regards music as a language of feeling, which is to be judged by its influence on the listener rather than any intrinsic stylistic quality or formal structure. Hastings prioritized what he referred to as virtuosic sensibility, or virtuous, I should say, sensibility. And he sought music composition and performance practices that served the great ends of religious edification. This is a term that popped up in this time in a lot of my research here. It's an interesting term. I'll talk a little about that in a moment. But in all of this, Hastings sought to define and reform musical taste, and in so doing, he hoped to awaken true sensibility. In advocating for an overall simplicity, Hastings showed that religious factors mattered more than purely aesthetic ones, and an incipient musical idealism, sired by Puritanism and born of evangelicalism, he saw was forming. Hastings was unable to accept the Fuging tune as anything other than an inferior music that was abused by the illiterate, as he called it. However, when compared with this double-mindedness, the critique does seem to lose some of its persuasiveness, at least to me, especially when you consider this is the same guy who wrote Top Lady, right? Rock of Ages, ya-da-dee, na-da-dee. You just need a little Leslie on the organ to play there. He's, well, you don't play that kind of organ, yes. Yes, your melanin count is not quite where it should be for that kind of Hammond B3 organ. But so yes, it's interesting to see what these guys criticized and what they put out. If you look at Thomas Hastings in our hymnal, some lilting 6/8 music that looks like vanilla ice cream with sprinkles of all great colors, and then you taste it and you're like, there's no taste in these sprinkles, right? It's just, it seems, compared to some of the fun that we see, the rough and raucous nature. Anyway, I digress. Yeah, Lowell Mason, you can't leave Lowell Mason off the chopping block here too. The turn of the 19th century, musical trends were changing, and the American Fuging tune was giving way to what was referred to as by Gilbert Chase as the inevitable advance of the progressive movement. It was the forerunner of musical populism. I don't know who's the musical Donald Trump, but I'm sure there's somebody we can find there that is. Like Thomas Hastings, Lowell Mason sought musical reform from the previous generation's metrical psalmody, and its leading offender he called the Fuging Psalm tune. In his National Psalmist, his publication, he complained that there is more variety in one piece of fuging music than in 20 pieces of plain song. He goes on to say that the lawless and awkward progression of chords, or by the incongruous convolutions of the parts and the tunes, were admired in proportion to the popular taking character of the melodies, or to the wonderment with which the different parts were introduced, twisted about, entangled, bewildered, evolved, and at length brought out in safety. In other words, Mason believed the Fuging tune's appeal was in its entertainment and not the worship of God. He argued that what he called the abuses of psalmody needed reformation. I don't know that I want to go with him down that track entirely. Oliver Holden, his forerunner and colleague, echoed this when he said similar sentiments. Fuging music in general is badly calculated for divine worship because, as another gentleman says, Samuel Holyoke, another man at the same time, parts falling in one after the other, each conveying a different idea, confound sense, and render the performance a mere jargon of words. To which I want to say, hello, have you ever listened to Bach? You know, if that is the criteria, each conveying a different idea, if it confounds sense, why would you hold up Bach? There's an elitism going on here. There's an elitist. Yes, I'm a populist in this sense. I'm probably, anyway, but I digress there too. So Mason's does criticize here. And Billings had his flair for the dramatic. Billings was untrained, but he was not unable to see the value of his music, and he was working. He was a product of his time, a time which we, I think, are similarly in. That's not to say that some of the criticisms that were raised by Law and Hastings and Mason should be ignored entirely. There, of course, is a place for the hearing and understanding of the word preached and sung in the church's service, no doubt. Their issues arise when philosophy separates hearing and understanding from the whole formative work that singing and hearing provide in worship. It seems to be that there's a breaking apart, both the singing and the hearing. There's an overemphasis, an out-of-balance approach to the hearing of the words, but the participatory quality of our worship should resolve that perceived problem for us. But sadly, it didn't seem to be as much in these guys' writings. Finally, and most importantly, the Fuging tune was an outward-focused expression rather than an inward one. I think that's something very worth camping out on and dwelling. Richard Crawford asserts that in the singing of the 18th century Fuging tune was primarily directed towards the ear of God instead of man's ear. Yeah, even though you are singing to one another, as the Ephesians and Colossians say, there is a toward the ear of God. He concludes that the reform of early 19th century New England psalmody, the stuff of Mason and Hastings and these guys, partakes of a wholly different spirit. For it was concerned and centered not on praise, it would seem, but on, as I mentioned earlier, edification. A different thing. Rather than God, its main recipients were the people who worshiped God. What were their impressions? How did it speak to them? It seemed a bit out of balance. And ultimately, this difference in orientation accounts for how and why the Fuging tune is either loved or loathed. The objections that Law and Hubbard and others suggest make note the fact that the church service must understand and meditate on the song lyrics if the right worship is going to be perceived as happening. Okay, that may or may not be the case, depending on the week, depending on the age of the person in the room. There's a lot of room to make some nuancing for sure. The Fuging tune's florid and overlapping text layering makes it harder for the hearer to hear and ascertain what is a no doubt busy text. There's a lot of things happening. In any case, if the audience is not merely the person hearing the singing, but also the performer and ultimately the triune God who sits in the heavens, then homophonic hymn texture and lyrics and music need not be the ultimate singing goal of worship. We can have a very broad and diverse styles, and the Fuging tune has a place. A few counterpoints here to close. The Fuging tune arose in a time and division between those who advocated for regular singing and rote singing or singing from memory. And there was this okay, the vernacular has taken over, the clergy have lost control, as Richard Crawford and Michael Broyles say. But even still, the Fuging tune has provided some great lessons for the church, and it's still ready to do so today. So hopefully this will be an encouragement to you. First, the Fuging tune provides a worthwhile challenge to these, or provided a worthwhile challenge to those churches that were in rural congregations seeking to learn and sing God's word as best they could. Church leaders could more easily line out older psalmody than they could do with a Fuging tune. However, the Fuging tune created a stir in singing from the average parishioner in America's growing frontier congregations. The Fuging tune facilitated the rise of the itinerant singing master, more than would have been possible with simple homophonic song settings. I think, as Ken mentioned, there is a desire for polyphony and fugue. If God is the chief musician, and all of the cosmos, in a sense, is a cosmic fugue or a cosmic symphony, it's no wonder that we would want to sing polyphony when we can, even if it's rustic and Yankee singing in style, than just singing a nice Rock of Ages, right? Top Lady Hastings tune. I'm being uncharitable to Hastings. He did some good work. Second, that's worth mentioning, that the Fuging tune spurred on churches to learn to sing with greater literacy. Second, the Fuging tune as a song form provides, I want to argue, a microcosm of what the church is doing when they worship and work. Think about a Fuging tune. Not everybody's egalitarian doing everything at the same time. You've got the basses doing this, the tenors doing that, the altos, the sopranos. It comes together. It paints a picture. You can't sing a Fuging tune by yourself. Right. It's not individualistic, it's corporate. And that's a metaphor, an example that's helpful to build into the DNA without even having to highlight it too often. Also, even though it was poorly sung by some, the Fuging tune skillfully illustrates this object lesson for us, that life is not uniform, it's not egalitarian. Instead, our life and our worship is unified by the one who holds all things together. If you're listening and relying on your faculties, life seems like a cacophony. But our Heavenly Father, the sounds of this life are a cosmic symphony woven together by a masterful composer who uses every harsh sound and dissonance to layer and style his grand composition. I think in some ways they're not accounting charitably for these rough themes of the Fuging tune in the 1700s. These later composers are not speaking with charity and gratitude and understanding enough, in my estimation. So I want to praise the Fuging tune. While much of the critiques of the Fuging tune relate to its compositional and performance components, or perceived lack thereof, some biblical principles should not only temper the criticisms, but give support to the Fuging tune. First, the New Testament clearly states that faith comes by hearing, as we know in Romans 10. Hearing is, it would seem, Peter Lightheart can correct me, it seems the most critical sense when it comes to gospel work. However, this text is not a proof text necessarily for homophonic psalmody or polyphonic Fuging tunes, but the scriptures speak of singing to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. There is a one anotherness or outward posture in singing that suggests singing is more than praise and worship to God, to our Heavenly Father. That's important to note. What is it? Singing is the first sense you get and the last sense you lose. It seems important to give the hearing, I like to say in music education and in all of life, it's hearing, doing, then understanding. It's not understanding, then doing. Your kids don't understand what a past participle is, right? They hear you use a past participle in sentence. They hear you use the word befuddled, and they don't know what that means, but they say it to their siblings, right? They didn't understand it first. They heard it. They did it. Understanding comes later. I digress. Second, meaning does not come only through lyrics. Ken Myers can give a treatise on this. John Hodges, we know the meaning is not just in the text, but the text needs to text paint. It needs to carry along by the music. It needs to amen, as it were, the music. Billings still was able to do this, believe it or not. He was able to do this with some of his compositions, even with his backwoods, country, rude character psalmody training. In his famous Easter anthem, which is a Fuging anthem, not a Fuging tune. This is where you push your glasses up. It's a nerdy distinction that I will not belabor here. But look at just the simple text painting that even he is able to possess without a European training. right? And did he rise, and did he rise, and did he rise, right? In the climax of that Corinthians telling of the Easter anthem. Wonderful setting. Our kids love to sing this. It's very fun. It's doable. It has those rustic fourths and fifths. It's a lot of fun, but he did this, and he wasn't the only one. Timothy Swan, in his rainbow setting, "'Tis by thy strength," and "Tempest cease to roar." You see the basses hold that out, and it just fades away to nothing. It's a very interesting text painting. It's not life-changing. He doesn't make the sign of the cross and the Kreutzer motif that Bach does in the Bach 4, right? But he didn't have the training that Bach did. So that's worth noting. Lastly, of this, thankfulness and not despising the day of small beginnings seems to be missing in much of the criticism of the American Fuging tune, I would argue. While some may see the Fuging tune as a mercenary activity designed to entertain more than to worship, it is still rooted in the practice of singing the psalms, albeit the metrical psalms. Fine. People in America wrote and performed these tunes despite not having the same training as many of their counterparts in England. These American frontier churches embodied the adage, anything worth doing is worth doing badly. And that doesn't mean strive for the subpar, but instead it means one should strive for excellence, skill, and understanding. But in the meantime, give thanks where you are, don't be complacent, and move on to go from humble beginnings and move from glory to glory. Finally, musicians and music historians overly criticize this art form known as the Fuging psalm tune for its primitive construction, as we've mentioned, rustic performance practice, and despite this criticism, the Fuging tune seems to combat rationalistic tendencies that came to us since the Enlightenment, because it pictures worship in a different way, it pictures it corporately, even if it doesn't explicitly say that. Yankee Fuging tunes that were so often marked with what has been called by Richard Crawford as jarring dissonance sung percussively at a moderate speed. Still, these works and the musicians that came following in the 1800s overlooked the Fuging tune because of those humble Yankee beginnings. There's a bunch of ambiguity of terminology, as I hope you're gleaning, and there's mischaracterizations. The Fuging tune has still withstood this amount of criticism. For this reason, William Billings and others have endured a myriad amount of judgments from people like Andrew Law that I mentioned, and Hastings and Lowell Mason. They mistook the Fuging tune's rustic style and sometimes crude performance practices for mere entertainment not worthy of sacred music. In reality, the Fuging tune at its best invites the listener and the singer to hearken to its outward-focused expression of worship, work, and life. It brings much-needed remedy for much of what ails the 21st century church in America. I would argue that's where we are again. We are fooling ourselves if we think we can pick up Bach and pick up Palestrina tomorrow, but we can pick up the Fuging tune with joy and thankfulness, and it is a gateway drug, as you could say, to not CCM gateway drug. It is a gateway drug into maturity if done right with thankfulness. So we would do well to give thanks for the Fuging tune, to give thanks for William Billings, and use that tune where we can to bring about some of the same catalysts of singing in the life of our churches and our communities. Thank you.
Amen.
We need to stop maybe 30 seconds. Something was crazy.